In this lesson, we're going to cover importing and exporting in MongoDB. Now, for this lesson, make sure you go ahead and download and unzip the attached files. You should have contacts.csv as well as mathgrades.js. Go ahead and make sure you transfer those over to your VirtualBox. And if we take a look at these files, contacts is just a CSV file. So it looks a lot like a SQL database table. First name, last name, username, date of birth, user status, user type, and created date. But there's several. I believe there's quite a number on here of contacts. The other table is called mathgrades. And if I go ahead and open that up with Sublime, you'll see that it is actually JSON documents. One JSON document per line with an ID field, a student ID, an exam, and a score. And typically this is not the type of table we would have, because normally the student ID wouldn't be here, it would directly be with a student. But for this purposes of performing importing and exporting, this works for us. So once they're up on the system, go ahead and open a window and connect to MongoDB to the admin database. And we're going to say let's use ADB. Next, let's go ahead and open up a second window and just make sure that you're in the home ADB directory. And once you log in, you should be directly there. It's where we created backup and export and all of those. Okay. So here's some big differences. Import and export is similar to backup and restore, but import and export occurs on a collection level, while backup and restore occurs on a database level, meaning when I do an export or an import, there are no users, there are no indexes, it's just the data going into one collection, or in SQL into one table. And there are some abbreviations, and Mongo's a little inconsistent on some of these. If you see a -d or a -db, that's the database. A -c or a -- collection is for the collection. And then you'll see stuff like the type, which can be JSON, CSV, or TSV. I'll explain those in a minute. And then -- file is the file to be exported or imported. So let's look at an example. If I want to import data, we need to use Mongo import, just like we used Mongo backup and Mongo restore. You give it a username, a password, a database, a collection, and then a file to import. And because we're importing a JS file, and don't confuse this with a JavaScript file, and by the way, they may also be named .json for .json. It really doesn't matter what the extension is. Some people use .js, some people use .json for JSON files. It's irrelevant. There's not really a set way to do it. But we are going to go ahead and import it. And since we're using a JSON file, there's not a whole lot of settings. So what I'm going to do is run that import. But I'm going to run it, of course, at the operating system prompt. And it needs to be in the same directory where mathgrades.js is. So let me paste it. And by the way, you'll often get this error when copying and pasting, especially copying and pasting from something like Word. For some reason, Word likes to combine stuff. So it confuses dashes with minus signs and vice versa. And although to me and you they look the same, here they don't. Notice I just retyped all of the dashes and now it works. It says it brought in 800 records. Well, let's verify that. Let's do a show collections. And there is mathgrades. So I'm going to say db.mathgrades.find.pretty, just to be sure. Yeah, that looks good. We have a student ID, a type, and a score. And I'll tell you what, for the moment, let's also do a count. and 800, just like here it said 800 records imported. Now importing a JSON file is the easiest. Importing a CSV file is a little bit more difficult. And there's two ways to approach this. You can either say import, again, username, password, database, collection. That's fine. Next one, type is CSV. We need to specify the type, otherwise it defaults to JSON. There is the file. And the last one is the fields. And there can't be any spaces in here, but essentially it's going to attach these fields to the well, obviously first name to the first column, last name to the second column, to convert it, and because obviously they need names. If you look here, for each one we need student ID type score. We would need to put student ID type and score if this was being imported as a CSV file. Now there is something else we can do. We can say minus minus header line, and here's what's going to happen if we do that. Let me bring that file up one more time. I want to bring up contacts.csv. What header line is going to do is say, take the first line, treat it as the column names and not data. So when this loads, Jane, Sally, Jack, Bain, they're all going to be labeled as first name. Smith, Jones, Dole, and Bloodlust are all going to be last name, so on and so forth. The first row is not data, it is the header. So let's go ahead and run that. I'm going to run it with the header line here. So let me grab this one. Again, we're loading contacts. The file is contacts.csv, header line, and again, run it at the OS terminal. And that took about 2 seconds, and it imported 97,000 documents. Let's check that again. Let's do a show collections. And we have a new one here called contacts. So I'll say db.contacts.count. And 97,304. So they all did import. So let's do a find here and do a pretty, just to make sure it's correct. And yes, first name, last name, username, date of birth, status type, everything's in the right spot. So we're good so far. That's really the extent of doing a import. There's also something called a TSV, which is a tab delimited file, meaning the fields are not separated by commas, they're separated by tabs. This was really popular 30 years ago on the mainframe days. It's really almost never seen these days, but they added it in as an option. It's not something we're going to cover. Exporting. Exporting is pretty much as easy. It's Mungo export, the database, the collection. The type, you can export as CSV. We can export it as JSON as well. Tell what the file to put out, and we need to name the fields. By the way, when you say minus minus fields and give it the fields, there can't be a space here. If there's a space, then it thinks that this is a new command, a new setting, and it will error out. So let's go ahead and I'm going to run an export here, and I'm going to export from the ADB database user collection. The type should be CSV. We're going to create ADB ImportExport.csv and the fields. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it over here. Again, too many positional parameters. What does that mean? Well, it did one of those funky things, dash dash, where it is confusing dashes and spaces. Dashes and minus signs, sorry. We still get it. So what I may have to do is also retype some of the spaces in here. Is it minus out or minus? Let's try minus minus out. That might be it. There we go. And again, that worked fairly quickly. Let's check it. If I do an ls minus l, we were exporting it to ADB Export.csv. So I'll tell you what, let me run a test here. If I refresh, and then I take ADB Export.csv and I download it, I can go over here now and open it. And we can do a comparison of what it imported and exported. And oops, look, the type and the name field, I named them incorrectly. So it should have been first name and last name. But it did export the fields that I specified. Tell you what, I can fix this. Let's run it again. But let's correct this. Instead of being type, it's user type with a capital T. And instead of being name, it's first name and last name. Let's pull that file down one more time. And now when I open it, there is first name, last name. And the user type, I also misspelled, so we just get blanks. Being that Mungo is schemaless, if you do try to export a field that doesn't exist, it just exports blanks. Remember, not everyone has a height. Now, that works nicely for flat records, meaning strings, integers. What would happen, or what do you think would happen, if we tried to export perhaps an array? Well, let's give that a shot. And let's see here. Too many windows open. I am going to do another export here. And it says 6 records. Well, let's take a look. Let's refresh. Let's bring this down. And then let's open up. And look here. I need to correct the type and the name again. We can do that. But here's what I wanted to show you. Look at children. Instead of trying to do any fancy stuff, because obviously it's an array, it's multiple variables, it's just going to dump the entire array inside of a field called children. Which really, I mean, it's the data's there, but it's really not that useful, except for looking through it. But this should be split up into another table, which it really can't do. But I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and just for completeness, let's fix this. So let's export user type first name, last name. Again, let's pull down the file. And let's open it up just to be sure. Yep. There's the client, first name, last name, the Mark Zuckerberg and John Winchester we created earlier. And again, it dumped the entire array into the children field. And that array can be pretty big. But that's how Mungo Export handles multi-dimensional fields, meaning like arrays. So, one thing to go ahead and note, and I want to repeat this again, when you do an import or an export, it's done at the OS prompt. Do not do it at the Mungo prompt. It will not work. If I do Mungo export here, it doesn't even know what I'm talking about. Anyway, thank you. I hope this lesson helped.